Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the frostbitten, blood-spattered, utterly intense world of Viking Berserkers, the raging human hurricanes of Norse mythology and history. These weren't your average sword-swinging raiders. They were walking chaos, feared by enemies, respected by comrades, and, let's be honest, probably avoided at the after-party. From bone-crunching rituals to possibly drug-fueled rages, being a berserker wasn't just about the glory of battle, it was a brutal, messy, and deeply psychological existence. So if you're the kind of person who's ever wondered what it really took to go full battle mode in the 9th century, you're in for a wild ride. Before we begin, give the video a like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the work I put into bringing history alive one dark tale at a time. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how far this little corner of history travels around the world. Now, dim those lights, maybe throw on a flickering fireplace loop for ambiance, and brace yourself. We're about to unravel a story that's part adrenaline, part madness, and all raw survival. Because berserkers weren't superheroes, they were human, often haunted, sometimes broken, and always on the edge of something primal. So if you thought going berserk just meant yelling loudly and swinging an axe, oh no, friend, the truth is far darker, far colder, and far more intense than you were ever told. Let's begin. Imagine this. You're standing on a battlefield in 9th century Norway, clutching a spear with frozen fingers, trying not to soil yourself as the enemy screams toward you. Suddenly, from your own side, a man breaks rank. He's shirtless because why not? His skin painted with ash, eyes wide and foaming at the mouth, like he just gargled a horn of rabid badger. He howls, not like a man but like something dragged out of a fever dream, and runs headlong into the enemy line, swinging an axe the size of a small canoe. You don't know whether to cheer or slowly step away. That, allegedly, was a Viking berserker. To the modern imagination, the word berserker conjures a very specific image: the wild-eyed Norseman who taps into a sort of battle cheat code, going Super Saiyan before Super Saiyan was a thing. They're painted as the elite shock troops of Viking warfare, immune to pain, unrelenting in aggression, and so untamed that even their own commanders pointed them at the enemy like living battering rams and hoped for the best. But here's the thing: history, as usual, is more complicated and messier and probably smellier. Let's start with the name itself, Berserker. It's Old Norse, and like all Old Norse things, it's a little ambiguous and terrifying. It either means bear shirt, as in someone wearing a bearskin into battle, or bear shirt, as in shirtless because naturally the best way to fight in sub-zero temperatures is topless. Either way, it's the kind of title that says, I have no regard for social norms, or body warmth, or your spleen. The earliest accounts of berserkers come from Norse sagas, those poetic, often blood-soaked stories passed down in oral tradition, and eventually written in a script that looks like a keyboard malfunction. In these sagas, berserkers are described as terrifying forces of nature. They're said to bite their shields, howl like animals, and enter a trance-like fury that renders them immune to pain, fear, and apparently fashion. They didn't just fight people, they tore through them like a toddler through a Lego castle. One saga even claims that they could not be harmed by fire or iron during their rage, which, to be clear, would make them excellent employees at a modern ironworks, but somewhat suspect as historical fact. Naturally, medieval writer, especially Christian, ones loved this stuff. A foaming mad pagan tearing his enemies limb from limb. Yes, please. That's exactly the kind of thing you write about when you're trying to convince people that converting to Christianity means fewer beheadings and slightly more stable dinner parties. But here's where the saga meets the skepticism. Most of these stories were written centuries after the events they supposedly describe. Imagine trying to reconstruct modern warfare using nothing but Marvel movies and barroom retellings of Call of Duty matches. That's the kind of reliability we're dealing with. For all their literary flair, The sagas are not peer-reviewed military histories. They're closer to historical fan fiction with a body count. So what do we actually know? Archaeology, that patient, dirt-covered party pooper, offers a few clues and some loud silences. So far, there's no conclusive evidence of berserker uniforms, bear pelts or otherwise, no war clubs made from unicorn femurs, and no burial sites with a tombstone that reads, "Here lies Skall the Shirtless, Axe, Spanker of the Fjords." What we do have are runestones and scattered historical mentions of elite warriors who seemed different. Not in a well-moisturized way, but in a he just chewed through a shield kind of way. Even the contemporary sources are split. Some describe berserkers as a distinct class of warrior, others lump them in with royal bodyguards or elite shock troops. There are references to their berserker gang, a state of uncontrollable rage so intense it often ended with the berserker collapsing, shivering, and possibly regretting everything, like a very angry hangover. In fact, that's one of the strangest truths to emerge from these tales. Berserker rage wasn't some magical ability. It was more like a storm they entered and couldn't always exit on command. The same fury that made them useful on the battlefield made them problematic at home. There are plenty of sagas where berserkers commit heroic act-slaying bandits, defending kings, but just as many where they, say, challenge random people to death matches at dinner or go on rampages because someone insulted their soup. These weren't stoic warriors. These were powder kegs with beards. Even in their own time, berserkers seemed to make people uncomfortable. Old Norse laws specifically banned berserker gang, suggesting that the whole uncontrollable battle frenzy thing was frowned upon when used outside of official slaughter hours. In medieval Iceland, for instance, going berserk in public could get you outlawed, which is Viking for, you now have the legal rights of a snowman. So what causes this kind of behavior? Historians and neuroscientists have offered theories, and none of them involve actual invincibility. One popular idea is that berserkers entered a dissociative state triggered by stress, ritual, and maybe the Norse equivalent of heavy metal music. In other words, they psyched themselves into madness. Controlled madness, ideally, like flipping the rage switch and hoping it didn't snap off. Other theories are a bit more pharmacological. Some researchers suggest that berserkers may have used psychoactive substances like Amanita muscaria, the infamous red and white spotted mushroom that makes reindeer fly and humans foam at the mouth. It's not the kind of high you take to relax. It's the kind of high where you scream at trees and try to headbutt a pine cone into submission. Could berserkers have been tripping into battle? Possibly. But keep in mind that Amanita muscaria doesn't dull pain or improve coordination. It makes people vomit, twitch, and occasionally hallucinate their ancestors, asking for rent money. So while it might explain the frenzy, it doesn't exactly make you a better fighter, just a more unpredictable one. But even if there were no mushrooms involved, there's another explanation that's both simpler and more brutal: trauma. Imagine being raised in a warrior culture where battle is glorified, pain is suppressed, and death is always just over the next hill. Now imagine going through enough fights, losing enough friends, getting wounded enough times, that the only way to keep going is to shut your emotions down completely and let the fury do the talking. That's not Mr. Khalid's tragic, and it makes perfect sense that some of these warriors snapped. Rage, after all, is one way the body protects itself when it's been broken too many times. In that light, the berserker isn't just a savage or a legend. He's a man too damaged to function outside of war, a casualty of a culture that praised his madness until it became inconvenient. Of course, none of that stopped the image from becoming iconic. Later Norse poets, and eventually modern writers, couldn't resist the allure of the berserker, the lone warrior, too powerful to control, too wild to tame. He's shown up in everything from fantasy novels to heavy metal album covers to that friend of yours who gets too intense during paintball. But the real man beneath the myth, he probably didn't feel like a god. He felt cold, exhausted, and dangerously unhinged. If you think that's dramatic, remember that the very idea of a berserker implies not just strength, but surrender to fury, to pain, to something darker than even the battlefield could explain. So the next time you hear the term going berserk, don't picture a superhero. Picture a man who's lost just enough of himself to become more dangerous than any sword in his hand. And maybe, just maybe, pity him a little, because once the rage burned out, all that was left was a trembling figure in the snow, wondering what part of himself had been lost in the scream. Becoming a Viking berserker was not, as one might hope, a matter of filling out a form and receiving a welcome packet that included a complimentary bear pelt and a list of acceptable shield-biting techniques. No, entering the ranks of these notorious warriors required something far more dramatic, something bloodier, colder, and quite possibly more hallucinogenic than any HR department could legally sanction. Because if regular Viking life was already rough, think drafty huts, pickled fish, and a professional life expectancy measured in raids than berserker training was like taking that and cranking the misery dial until it snapped off in your frostbitten hands. The first thing to understand is that nobody stumbled into berserking by accident. It wasn't a job you took because the boat-building apprenticeship didn't pan out. It was a callinger, more precisely, a plunge into a different kind of existence. To be a berserker was to reject the social fabric of Norse life and replace it with something far hairier and less predictable. Imagine announcing to your clan, "I've decided to become a battle-maddened wolf, spirit conduit." That's not just a career pivot, that's a full psychological relocation. But before the howling and the bloodletting, there was the initiation. And this was no toga party. Becoming a berserker meant undergoing a transformation, and like most ancient rites of passage, it was designed to strip you of your former self literally, spiritually, and very possibly epidermally. The goal was not just to prepare you for battle, it was to erase the man and carve out a beast in his place. Let's start with the symbolism of the animal skin. Whether you were donning a bear pelt, the burr in Berserker, or a wolf hide, used by the Ulfhednar, a sort of berserker cousin, this wasn't just practical outerwear for a chilly campaign. It was a metaphysical costume change. You weren't just putting on fur, you were becoming the creature. You were inviting its spirit to crawl under your skin and take the wheel. Today we call this cosplay. Back then, it was shamanism with a body count. The ritual itself likely varied by region and century, but the broad strokes are consistent. Isolation, endurance, suffering, and a hearty dose of spiritual delirium. Candidates were often taken into the wilderness because if you're going to undergo psychological disintegration, you may as well do it where wolves outnumber therapists. There, they would fast, chant, meditate, or scream whatever the local flavor dictated. Some sources suggest ritual combat, where initiates had to fight other berserkers or animals, or at least endure beatings that would make modern MMA look like light yoga. The idea was to push the body and mind past the point of recognition. You had to crack to be rebuilt. And of course, there was blood. Blood was central not just in the figurative sense, but in the very real, let's smear this on your face and see what happens way. Animals were sacrificed, sometimes even humans, depending on how serious your cult chapter was feeling that week. Their blood might be used to anoint the initiate, mixed into a potion, or consumed as part of a hallucinogenic brew that doubled as both sacrament and gastrointestinal dare. If you think frat parties are bad, imagine one where someone says, "Drink this, it's goat blood and fungus," and it might open a portal in your mind, or just make you vomit for 9 hours. We don't have a complete step-by-step manual for these initiations, probably because berserkers weren't big on journaling, but we can piece together likely elements from later accounts. Comparative traditions and sheer grim logic, sleep deprivation, hunger, cold exposure all were likely standard fare. It's hard to maintain a stable grip on reality when you haven't eaten in 3 days, you're half naked in the snow, and someone is chanting in your ear while waving a severed deer head, the mind begins to unravel. Which is exactly the point. Because Berserker training wasn't about skill, it wasn't fencing lessons or axe technique. It was about becoming unkillable through sheer indifference to your own suffering. Pain had to mean nothing. Fear had to be composted into fury. The Berserker didn't walk into battle hoping to win. He walked in daring the world to stop him. And to get to that state, you had to die a little metaphorically, and perhaps, on a bad day, literally. Consider the transformation as a form of controlled madness. You were being taught how to snap, not in the panicked, chaotic way that most people snap, but in a precise, rehearsed, spiritually weaponized kind of way. Your rage had to be accessible on command, like a tool, or more accurately, like a wildfire with a leash. The rituals were about summoning that fury, dancing with it, and then teaching yourself not to flinch as it licked your bones. Some modern scholars believe these rites had deep ties to Norse shamanic practices either, a kind of trance magic that allowed practitioners to commune with spirits, see the future, or just generally disturb dinner guests. Odin himself, the All-Father and part-time war god, was said to have practiced Seether and was considered the patron deity of berserkers. Which means that your initiation wasn't just about joining a warrior cult, it was aligning yourself with a god who hung himself from a tree for 9 days just to learn secret knowledge. Casual stuff. So what kind of person signed up for this? Not your average villager. Berserkers were often social outsiders to begin with. Some were said to be orphans, exiles, or outlaws. Others were chosen young, selected for their aggression, their unpredictability, or perhaps just their unnerving habit of gnawing on fence posts. And once chosen, there was no going back. Berserker gang, the state of going berserk, wasn't something you could switch off once you got tired of the screaming. It stayed with you. You became it. And that meant living a life at the edges of society, revered and feared in equal measure. The rites reinforced this separation. When you undergo a transformation designed to kill your empathy and replace it with rage, you don't just go back to farming rutabagas. You don't return to polite company. You live apart. Some berserkers traveled as mercenaries, selling their violence to the highest bidder. Others served as royal guards, a sort of armed liability kept close in case of emergency. And some simply wandered, lone wolves in a world that no longer made sense to them. And make no mistake, this transformation came at a cost. While the sagas portray berserkers as nearly supernatural, there are hints of the psychological wreckage underneath. After their frenzies, berserkers were said to collapse, trembling and spent. Some experienced violent visions or seizures. Others suffered from what we'd now call PTSD, or something uncomfortably close to it. The rituals may have awakened something primal, but they did little to soothe it afterward. You became the beast, but the beast didn't go to sleep when the battle ended. All of this underscores a hard truth. Being a berserker wasn't just painful, it was alienating. Your very identity became entwined with destruction. The rites stripped away the human and replaced it with a creature of fury, and while that might have won you glory on the battlefield, it left you with precious little in the way of peace. You couldn't go back. You could only go forward into more battles, more blood, more madness, until one day, inevitably, you didn't come back at all. In many ways, the Berserker initiation was a cruel kind of alchemy. You entered it as a man and emerged as something else, something more dangerous, yes, but also something more alone. And if that sounds like a tragedy dressed up in bearskin, well, it probably was. There's a special kind of commitment involved in charging into a wall of spears while howling like a wolf, biting your own shield, and possibly foaming at the mouth. It's not the sort of thing most people wake up and do before breakfast, unless their breakfast involved a suspicious mushroom stew and a complete disregard for personal safety. Which brings us, with a rather pungent aroma, to the question historians and herbalists have been poking at for centuries: were Viking berserkers high? It's not just a modern assumption born from watching one too many fantasy series. The idea that berserkers entered battle in a chemically induced trance has lingered for a long time and for good reason. The berserker's behavior, as described in the sagas, reads less like traditional warfare and more like the side effects of a very intense pharmaceutical trial. They didn't just fight, they transcended the rules of fighting. Pain didn't register, reason fled the scene. Their own allies were sometimes afraid to stand near them, which is not exactly a glowing Yelp review for teamwork. Now, to be clear, we don't have a signed confession from a Viking warrior stating, "Had a lovely time pillaging Lindisfarne today. Big thanks to those red mushroomston, 10 would hallucinate again." But absence of evidence doesn't mean absence of questionable choices. And when you combine erratic, near-psychotic behavior with a culture steeped in ritual, nature, and spiritual possession, it's not a huge leap to suspect that Berserker Gang, the famous Berserker rage, might have had some help from nature's less cuddly compounds. Enter Amanita muscaria, the leading suspect in the Viking psychoactive lineup. You've probably seen it before. It's the classic toadstool of fairy tales. Bright red cap, white spots, looks adorable until you realize it may cause tremors, nausea, euphoria, sweating, and vivid hallucinations that occasionally include a deep sense of cosmic dread. Think of it as the mushroom equivalent of a surprise party thrown by Odin. This mushroom grows all over the Northern Hemisphere, including Scandinavia, and it's long been used by indigenous Siberian tribes in shamanic rituals, often involving trance states, ecstatic dancing, and spiritual possession activities that sound suspiciously berserker adjacent. Some theories suggest that Viking warriors might have ingested Amanita muscaria or a related substance to induce their battle frenzy. The logic is compelling. If you want to feel invincible, numb to pain, and divorced from your sense of self-preservation, a psychotropic mushroom isn't the worst tool in the box. But here's where things get tricky. Amanita muscaria doesn't work the way most people think. Unlike more user-friendly hallucinogens like psilocybin, the classic magic mushroom, Amanita muscaria doesn't just open your mind and give you a technicolor afternoon. It's erratic, unpleasant, and potentially dangerous. The active compounds, muscimol and ibotenic acid, interact with the brain in strange ways, sometimes resulting in euphoria, sometimes in uncontrollable spasms, and sometimes in the deep conviction that your intestines are conspiring against you, not exactly the kind of high you'd want before facing a heavily armed enemy. To make matters more theatrical, some traditional users didn't even eat the mushrooms directly. They drank the urine of reindeer that had eaten the mushrooms. Why? Because reindeer process the toxins in a way that filters out some of the worst side effects, while preserving the hallucinogenic punch. This means, yes, there is a non-zero chance that someone, somewhere, possibly a Viking berserker, once drank psychedelic reindeer pee to prepare for battle. And if that sentence doesn't make history more interesting than fiction, I don't know what will. Still, we have to be cautious. Just because something could have happened doesn't mean it did. There's no concrete archaeological evidence mushroom residue in a drinking horn. No runestone inscribed with "Bjorn got absolutely wrecked on fungus before the raid." The idea of drug-fueled berserkers is tantalizing but ultimately speculative. Even the sagas, with all their drama and poetic hyperbole, don't mention mushrooms directly. They do talk about madness, altered states, and divine possession, but those can come from trauma, ritual, or sheer adrenaline just as easily as fungi. And here's where things take a more human turn. Because as much as we love the idea of berserkers going into battle tripping harder than a squirrel on espresso, there's another, darker explanation: psychological conditioning. Imagine growing up in a culture that revered violence, worshipped gods of death and war, and taught that to die in battle was the greatest honor. You're told that fear is weakness, that pain is to be ignored, and that rage is a virtue. Now add in isolation, ritual humiliation, physical abuse, fasting, and possibly a few traumatic near-death experiences. Eventually, the brain rewires itself. It has to. You don't need mushrooms to enter a dissociative state if you've been trained to become the wolf. Some psychologists argue that Berserker Gang was less about external substances and more about internal chemistry. The human body is capable of producing a powerful cocktail of chemicals, adrenaline, endorphins, cortisol, that can mimic the effects of drugs when pushed hard enough. In moments of extreme stress, some people enter what's known as a fugue state, a kind of psychological autopilot where the conscious mind takes a back seat and instinct takes over. Soldiers have reported similar experiences in modern combat. It's not magic, it's biology, messy, brutal biology. This kind of frenzy would have been terrifying to witness and difficult to control. That aligns with the sagas, which often describe berserkers not as noble warriors, but as unpredictable hazards. They might win the battle, but they might also kill your favorite cousin in a post-fight meltdown. It's telling that laws were passed to ban Berserker Gang entirely in some Norse regions. You don't legislate against something unless it's causing problems. And nothing says problem like a man in a bear pelt chewing the furniture after dinner. Of course, all of this assumes that berserkers were a uniform group with standardized behavior, like a historical franchise with matching capes. The truth is probably messier. Some berserkers may have used drugs. Others may have relied on ritual, fasting, or sheer rage. Still, others might simply have been particularly violent men, given a cool title and too much mead. The Viking world wasn't monolithicite, stretched across centuries, seas, and cultural boundaries. What one chieftain called divine fury, another might have called that guy we don't invite to feasts anymore. And then there's the fact that berserkers were, in many ways, marketing. They were psychological warfare in animal form. If your enemy hears that you've got unkillable wolfmen on your side, warriors who can't feel pain and lose control in battle, they may rethink their life choices. Even if half the stories were exaggerated, the reputation alone was a weapon. Nobody wants to fight the guy who just growled at his own reflection. So were berserkers drugged out of their minds? Maybe. Were they emotionally shattered war machines? Also maybe. Was the truth a kaleidoscope of both, refracted through myth, fear, and a generous helping of poetry? Almost certainly. And here's the part that sticks with you. Whether they used mushrooms, madness, or muscle memory, berserkers were not superheroes. They were men. Men pushed to the brink, reshaped by violence, and celebrated for their ability to become something less than or, perhaps more than human. That transformation, whether chemically induced or spiritually invoked, was not painless. It was not clean. It was not glorious. It was blood and screaming and eyes gone wide in the cold. In the end, the real drug might not have been in a mushroom or a mead horn. It was in the culture. The deep, intoxicating brew of mythology, honor, fear, and expectation that told these men that to feel nothing was to be strong and to lose control was to be free. And if that isn't the most dangerous drug of all, I don't know what is. There's a moment in everyone's life when they willingly do something painful and tell themselves it's worth it. Maybe it's running a marathon, getting a tattoo, or attending a mandatory Zoom meeting that could have been an email. But imagine if your version of self-improvement involved being half naked in sub-zero temperatures, while someone hit you with sticks you hadn't eaten in days, and you were expected to scream at the sky as if the sky owed you money. Welcome to the pain-positive world of Viking berserker training, where physical torture wasn't a warning signet, was the curriculum. The logic, if you can call it that, was painfully straightforward. If you want to be unstoppable in battle, you first need to stop feeling anything, not just metaphorically, literally. Pain was a distraction, fear was weakness, and emotion was for people who didn't plan to chew their own shields before breakfast. And so, to create a warrior who could charge through a forest of spears like a man on fire and enjoy it, the Norse training method was simple. Make your life so miserable that battle actually feels like an improvement. From what we can tell thanks to sagas, scattered historical accounts, and a bit of educated masochistic guesswork, Berserker conditioning was designed to do two things: build unshakable endurance and extinguish the inner voice that says, hey, maybe let's not do this. Because that voice, helpful though it might be, when deciding whether to poke a bear, had no place in the Berserker brain. Let's start with the cold. Scandinavia is, to put it mildly, not known for its balmy winters, and yet, many Berserker rituals and routines involved voluntary exposure to freezing temperatures. We're talking snow-covered forests, icy rivers, wind that could slap the soul out of your body. Training often meant stripping down and spending hours, even days outside, with nothing but your rage and a thin layer of frostbite to keep you company. It wasn't about being tough for toughness' sake. Cold was a tool, a brutal, indifferent, ever-present instructor. If you could learn to move, to think, even to fight with frozen fingers and numb toes, then the battlefield blood-soaked, chaotic, and only moderately freezing would seem like a welcome sauna by comparison. Your body learned that comfort was irrelevant. Your nerves learned to shut up. Pain became background noise, like the crackling of a campfire you were definitely not invited to. But the cold was just the beginning. Pain needed to be constant, expected, routine, and so came the beatings. These weren't pub brawls or bar fights for fun. They were structured, intentional, and entirely without sympathy. Whether it was being hit with sticks, fists, or weapons dulled just enough to avoid immediate death, initiates were expected to endure violence, not as a punishment, but as a morning warm-up. You didn't complain, you didn't flinch, you certainly didn't cry. You stood your ground, took the blows, and let the world know that your threshold for suffering had long since packed its bags and fled. This wasn't just physical conditioning, it was psychological reprogramming. The human brain is wired to avoid pain. That's part of its job description, right next to keep breathing and don't let us walk into fire. But Berserker training flipped that instinct on its head. Pain wasn't the enemy, it was the doorway. And only by walking through it again and again and again could you become something that didn't hesitate when the time came to kill or die. Sleep deprivation was another favored tool in the Berserker toolkit, because nothing helps you access your inner wolf spirit quite like staying awake until the walls start whispering. Depriving the body of rest weakens rational thought, blurs emotion, and opens the door to altered mental state, exactly the state Berserkers needed to access on demand. Combine this with fasting, chanting, or even inhaling smoke from burning herbs or resins, and what you get isn't so much a training session as a recipe for a one-man apocalypse. One suspects that modern sports psychologists would not approve. But the genius of it, if you can call systematic suffering genius, is that it worked. By the time a Berserker entered battle, they had already fought harder trials. Hunger had been their sparring partner. Cold had stripped them of comfort. Pain had taken up permanent residence. When they charged into the fray, they weren't seeking victory, they were seeking release. For a moment, finally, they could move without restraint, scream without judgment, destroy without consequence. It was, perversely, a kind of freedom, short-lived, bloody, but honest. This level of conditioning didn't just make Berserkers dangerous, it made them terrifying. To see a man fight with broken bones, to watch him smile through gushing wounds, to hear him laugh as blades cut into him, that wasn't just morale shattering, that was unnatural. It felt wrong. Enemies facing Berserkers often hesitated, confused, unnerved, because when someone clearly doesn't care if they live or die, how exactly are you supposed to intimidate them? Taunt them? Negotiate? Even their own side didn't always know what to do with them. Berserkers were valued, yes, but they were also feared, not just because of what they did to enemies, but because of what they became. You didn't turn off Berserker Gang like a switch. That's not how trauma-induced trance states work. When the battle ended, when the blood cooled, the Berserker didn't go back to being a cheerful villager with a sense of boundaries. He was still wired for pain, still expecting it, craving it, maybe. Which meant that peacetime was difficult, relationships were difficult, small talk was very difficult. The sagas contain stories of berserkers turning on their allies, challenging dinner guests to death matches, or simply losing themselves entirely in post-battle tremors and confusion. The very training that made them effective in war made them liabilities elsewhere, and yet they endured. Because Norse culture, with all its brutal pragmatism, made space for this particular brand of damaged brilliance. The Berserker was necessary, until, of course, he wasn't. It's important to note that the pain wasn't just physical. The psychological cost of becoming a Berserker was immense. These were men who had to suppress not just their sensitivity to harm, but their entire emotional architecture. Compassion, useless in a Berserker. Fear, a liability. Grief, better crushed than expressed. What you ended up with was not a warrior in the classical sense. You ended up with someone halfway to something else, a liminal creature caught between man and monster. And the line between those two got blurrier with every blow they chose not to feel. In the modern world, we'd call this conditioning traumatic. We'd label it with diagnoses, offer therapy, perhaps even prescribe medication. But in the Viking Age, there was no couch to lie on. There was no safe space. There was only the battlefield, the ritual, and the endless need to prove that you still could, that you hadn't softened, that the beast was still awake, still hungry. This kind of voluntary suffering wasn't unique to the Vikings, of course. Many warrior cultures throughout history developed their own versions of pain as preparation. Spartan boys were whipped at festivals. Samurai trained with wooden swords that broke bones just as efficiently as the real thing. Indigenous tribes around the world have long used ordeals to initiate young warriors. But the Berserkers took this idea and turned it into something uniquely Scandinavian. Cold, stark, starkly cold. What they created wasn't just a warrior, it was a human weapon designed to endure not just the horrors of war, but the horror of becoming something that can thrive in it. So if you ever find yourself wondering how berserkers managed to fight with such reckless abandon, remember this: the battle was the easy part. The real struggle was before, in the cold, in the fasting, in the blows that left bruises not just on the skin, but on the soul. They didn't fear death because they'd already been introduced. And in that introduction, they lost something. Maybe it was the part of them that hesitated. Maybe it was the part that wept. Maybe it was the part that wondered if there was more to life than war. Whatever it was gone by the time they put on the bear pelt. Which leaves us with one of the most haunting truths of all. The Berserker didn't overcome pain. He absorbed it, carried it, became it. Pain wasn't a thing to avoid, it was the crucible in which he was forged. And once you've been made in fire and frost and fury, what else could you possibly be but dangerous? Or, depending on your perspective, deeply, terribly sad. If you've ever imagined a Viking berserker charging into battle clad in glittering armor, horned helmet, gleaming in the sun, swinging a pristine double-bladed axe like he's auditioning for a Scandinavian superhero franchise, well, congratulations, you've been thoroughly lied to by costume departments everywhere. The truth about what berserkers wore and carried is a bit less theatrical, a bit more practical, and far more uncomfortable. No, they didn't have enchanted weapons. No, they didn't have runic armor forged in dragon breath. And absolutely no, they did not wear horned helmets, unless, perhaps, you count head injuries as a fashion statement. Let's start with the horned helmet myth, because this one deserves to be gently, lovingly burned to the ground. The iconic Viking with horns look owes its popularity to 19th century opera set designers and a general public that loves its history, seasoned heavily with fantasy. Actual archaeological finds suggest that Viking helmets were, disappointingly for modern illustrators, practical iron caps with nose guards designed to protect the skull, not to resemble livestock. If a berserker had turned up to battle wearing antlers, he wouldn't have been admired. He would have been laughed at, then probably stabbed while adjusting them. So what did berserkers wear? That depends on which berserker you asked, and how far along he was in his particular descent into chaos. Many saga references, and this isn't a joke, suggest they went into battle shirtless. Not in a Mediterranean beach sort of way, but in a "this is what raw terror looks like" sort of way. The word berserker itself may derive from bare, and circa, shirt, meaning bare shirt. Another theory links it to bare shirt, suggesting warriors who wore bare hides. Either way, the fashion advice seems to have been, less is more, and fur is better when it's still growling. The idea of fighting shirtless in Northern Europe seems counterintuitive, especially in a region where the weather can politely be described as hostile to human warmth. But that was likely the point. A shirtless warrior was making a very clear statement. I am so consumed by rage that I no longer care about things like hypothermia, modesty, or common sense. It was psychological warfare. If you see a man screaming, naked from the waist up, covered in blood, possibly not all his, and wielding a weapon with no regard for his own safety, you don't think, "Ah yes, a measured opponent." You think, "I should have stayed home and harvested turnips." Now, the famous bear and wolf skins are a bit trickier. Some berserkers were said to wear these animal hides as totems, as physical symbols of their transformation into something more beast than man. A bear pelt draped over your shoulders, claws still attached, face snarling from your back, wasn't just dramatic. Flare it was a spiritual declaration. You weren't just channeling the strength of the bear or the cunning of the wolf. You were becoming it. The hide wasn't just clothing. It was your war paint, your armor of identity, which sounds poetic until you remember that a wet bear skin weighs about as much as a well-fed sheep and smells considerably worse. In terms of actual gear, berserkers were not outfitted like the elite knights of later medieval Europe. They didn't march onto the battlefield like walking ironclads. Viking armor, in general, was far more minimal than the popular image suggests. Chainmail existed, but it was expensive and heavy, and often reserved for wealthier warriors. Berserkers, who occupied a liminal space between elite and outcast, might have had access to bits and pieces, but full armor would have defeated the purpose. Remember, the whole point of a berserker was to be terrifyingly unhinged, not clanking politely into combat like a man late for his joust. Instead, they likely wore padded leather or nothing at all above the waist, depending on the season and their personal threshold for frostbite. Some may have smeared themselves in ash or animal blood to complete the look, which tells you everything you need to know about early Viking skincare routines. Functionally, this meant that berserkers were light, fast, and very exposed. They didn't rely on armor to protect them. They relied on speed, aggression, and the hope that if they were scary enough, nobody would stick around long enough to stab them. Weapons, however, were another matter. If the clothing said, "spiritual transformation," the weapons said, "you're about to regret your life choices." The most iconic berserker weapon was the axonot, the dainty kind you use for chopping firewood. But the massive, iron-bearded variety designed to split shields, skulls, and occasionally the laws of physics. Viking axes came in various sizes, from one-handed jobs for tight quarters to full-sized battle axes that required both arms and a sturdy sense of purpose. They weren't precision tools. They were blunt instruments of finality. And then there was the sworderer, more expensive and often viewed as a status symbol. Viking swords were pattern-welded works of brutal artistry, built to cleave through mail and bone alike. Owning a sword was like owning a car in a medieval economy. If a berserker had one, it meant he was either very successful or had taken it off someone who had been slightly less so. Other options included spears, which were cheap, effective, and great for the opening minutes of battle when everyone was still at a polite distance. Spears could be thrown or thrust, and a well-placed jab could take out an enemy before you even had to smell them. But for a berserker, whose whole thing was getting uncomfortably close as quickly as possible, spears were probably more of a warm-up act. Shields? Ah yes, shields. Now here's where things get weird. Berserkers were known to bite their shields before combat. Yes, bite them. Not bash them, not polish them, bite them. It wasn't because they were hungry or had unresolved dental issues. It was part of their pre-battle frenzy, a symbolic gesture of rage, so intense that even their own gear wasn't safe. Imagine being so mad you start attacking your own defensive equipment. That's a level of emotional volatility no anger management class can reach. In practice, the shield was still useful. Viking shields were round, wooden, rimmed with iron, and often painted with intimidating designs, serpents, wolves, or simple concentric circles meant to hypnotize or confuse. For the berserker, a shield could block a blow, but it could also be used offensively, slammed into an enemy's face, or used to push back a line. It was a weapon in its own right, though probably one that bore the occasional tooth mark. And then, of course, there's what berserkers broke. Aside from the obvious opponents, furniture, and the occasional moral boundary, berserkers had a reputation for destroying their own gear in the frenzy of battle. Swords bent, axes chipped, shields splintered. Not because the weapons were shoddy, but because the rage was real. Berserker fury wasn't delicate. It was like watching a man punch through a door, not to escape, but because the door looked at him funny. They also broke expectations. In a world that valued honor, restraint, and tactical thinking, at least occasionally, the berserker was a wild card. A loose bolt in an otherwise well-oiled war machine. Their gear reflected that. Not polished, not pristine functional, brutal, and occasionally improvised. You didn't go into battle looking to impress a weapons inspector. You went in to tear, stab, howl, and win. What's fascinating is that despite their chaotic nature, berserkers weren't untrained. They didn't just flail wildly and hope for the best. Their gear, however minimal, had purpose. Their weapons were extensions of their madness. Their lack of armor wasn't ignorance, it was strategy, or, at the very least, an attempt to weaponize unpredictability. If you strip away the Hollywood embellishments, the berserker starts to look less like a mythical brute and more like an early practitioner of psychological warfare. Their appearance bare-chested, blood-smeared, wielding oversized axes was designed to terrify, and it did, but it came at a cost. Because fighting without armor is a lot like arguing on the internet. Without spell check you may make your point, but you're going to take some damage along the way. In the end, the berserker's gear wasn't about elegance or durability. It was about expression, a physical manifestation of the chaos inside. Their weapons were heavy, their armor was light or non-existent, and their fashion sense could best be described as apocalyptic chic. But all of it, every scarred blade and chewed-up shield, told the same story. I am not here to survive. I am here to overwhelm. And that, perhaps, is what made the berserker so unforgettable. Not the gear they wore, but the message it sent. No horned helmet required. It's always awkward being that guy at the party, the one who drinks too much, punches the wall, challenges the host to a duel, and then calmly sits back down like nothing happened. Now imagine that, but in a Viking longhouse, and the wall is someone's cousin, and the party ends in a blood feud that lasts 3 generations. That's roughly what it was like being a berserker in Viking society. Feared, respected, admired from a safe distance, and occasionally asked, with great caution, to leave and never come back. Berserkers were the human equivalent of a forest fire. Powerful, awe-inspiring, but not something you wanted near your livestock or your children. They were the apex predators of the Norse social landscape. You didn't befriend a berserker so much as orbit them, hoping that their gravitational pull didn't result in personal tragedy. To understand how these volatile war machines fit into their society, we have to take a step back and appreciate the Viking world for what it was. not the barbarian free-for-all of modern media, but a surprisingly complex, status-conscious, and law-abiding culturate, least when nobody was on fire. Viking society had rules, hierarchies, and deeply embedded values around honor, kinship, and the maintenance of order, which made integrating berserkers who, by definition, laughed in the face of order a bit of a social puzzle. On the one hand, berserkers were incredibly useful. Every society, at some point, needs someone to do the kinds of things that would make regular citizens lose their lunch. When it came to shock troops, berserkers were the original blunt instruments. You pointed them at a problem, removed any sharp objects from your own vicinity, and waited for the problem to be reduced to red mist and regrets. They excelled in raids, where chaos was an asset. The sight of a screaming, half-naked warrior, blood-streaked and biting his own shield, could do wonders for morale provided he was on your side. Their unpredictability was their weapon. Where most warriors hesitated, calculated, or responded to battlefield developments like rational human beings, the berserker had already thrown himself headfirst into the nearest knot of enemies, screaming something about wolves and destiny. And for that, they were admired. In the sagas, they're often portrayed as formidable champions, protectors of kings, and solo agents of destruction. They were not just hired muscle, they were symbols of raw, divine fury. To claim one in your service was like having a tiger on a leash, not safe, per se, but very, very impressive. Some Viking chieftains surrounded themselves with berserkers to guard their halls, send messages, unsubtly, and demonstrate their own importance. If your personal bodyguard has a reputation for frothing at the mouth and starting duels over seating arrangements, people tend to take you seriously. But admiration had its limits. The problem with employing an unstable force of nature is that it doesn't clock out when the raid is over. Berserkers weren't easy to switch off. Their rage, once summoned, had a tendency to linger. Post-battle reports often involved property damage, accidental homicide, and the kind of awkward silences that follow someone asking if the communal drinking horn has tasted fear. Some berserkers, to put it delicately, had difficulty with boundaries. The same man who split a Saxon in half at sea might also pick a fight with a wedding guest over who got the last piece of roasted boar. Their sense of social decorum could charitably be described as situational. If you were lucky, they just made everyone nervous. If you were less lucky, you found yourself explaining to your relatives why Uncle Thorbjorn now walks with a limp and flinches at the sound of chanting. Which brings us to the legal status of berserkers, something the Vikings took surprisingly seriously. Despite the general impression of Norsemen as wild, ale-sloshing maniacs, their societies were governed by intricate laws and customs. Iceland, in particular, had a sophisticated system of legal assemblies, the Thing, as it was rather wonderfully called, where disputes were settled, alliances forged, and reputations either salvaged or publicly set on fire. In this world of careful honor and legal balance, the berserker was an outlier, a valuable outlier, yes, but also a deeply problematic one. Their violence, when useful, was celebrated. When misdirected, it was criminal, and Viking law, for all its love of poetic justice, didn't take kindly to men who thought themselves above it. By the 10th century, some laws explicitly forbade the practice of berserkergang, the berserker's frenzy. In Iceland, going berserk outside of war, which happened more often than you'd like, could get you outlawed. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. Being outlawed meant you lost all legal protection. Anyone could kill you on sight, and nobody would bat an eye, except, perhaps, to make sure you stayed dead this time. Outlaws weren't just expelled. They were erased from polite society, turned into ghosts with swords. It's a telling paradox. The berserker, who was so often the enforcer of power, could also be cast out by it. One minute, you're a chieftain's most fearsome asset. The next, you're hiding in a cave, wondering if that goat noise was actually an ambush. Despite this tenuous position, berserkers carved out a space for themselves. They became cultural fixtures, the subject of songs, sagas, and bedtime stories designed to either inspire awe or encourage better behavior in children. Brush your teeth, or the berserker will get you, was probably a more effective threat than no dessert. Over time, their image evolved. In some stories, they're noble defenders. In others, monstrous villains. The saga Egil's Saga Skalla Grimsonar features berserkers who challenge people to fights for no reason beyond pride and bloodlust. In Hervarar Saga, berserkers are described almost like gangsters roaming in packs, demanding tribute and generally being the worst possible dinner guests. They become less like elite warriors and more like a roving curse with bad impulse control. And yet, there's always that undertone of respect. Even when berserkers are condemned, they're never dismissed. Their strength, their fearlessness, their sheer presence, these were qualities the Norse admired, even if they came with baggage. You didn't want one as a neighbor, but in a fight, you wanted 6, preferably between you and the nearest enemy army. It's worth noting that berserkers didn't live forever, not just because they kept throwing themselves into combat like death was a side quest, but because society changed. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the appetite for uncontrollable violence diminished. Kings sought order, churches frowned on men who foamed at the mouth and bit shields like they were auditioning for an exorcism. Slowly, the berserker fell out of favor not because they were less fearsome, but because the world had changed its taste in heroes. By the 12th century, berserkers had become more legend than fact. Their spiritual fury was recast as demonic possession. Their sacred rage became madness. What had once been a source of status became a cautionary tale. The man who had been too wild to tame was now too wild to trust. But even as they faded into myth, the tension remained. The berserker was always caught between two worlds, admired and feared, exalted and exiled. They were the ultimate contradiction, the outsider at the center of the fight, the hero you kept just close enough to be useful and just far enough that you wouldn't wake up missing an ear. And maybe that's what makes them so enduring. The berserker wasn't just a man. He was an idea symbol of what happens when power is unshackled from consequence. A walking embodiment of rage, purpose, and tragedy. So the next time someone romanticizes the Viking Age, with horned helmets and noble warriors, sipping mead in harmony, remember the berserker. Remember the man who stood at the feast hall's edge, eyes wild, chest bare, and reputation just one shield bite away from permanent exile. He was feared, he was revered, and let's be honest, was never really invited. There are many things in history that would have been awe-inspiring to witness. The pyramids rising from the Egyptian sand, a Roman triumph parading spoils through the Forum, the first ships of the Viking Age slipping into uncharted waters. And then there's the berserker battle trance, something decidedly less awe-inspiring and considerably more unsettling. Less majestic vista, more, did that man just eat his own shield? To the average Viking, watching a berserker enter a battle trance was probably the psychological equivalent of standing too close to a campfire that suddenly decides it no longer wants to stay in the fire pit. One moment, there's a man sweaty, angry, possibly shirtless. The next, there's not a man, not quite an animal, but something in between, howling, twitching, and charging headlong into battle like he's auditioning to become a Norse cautionary tale. It wasn't just rage, it was something deeper, stranger, and utterly at odds with social norms, common sense, and the continued survival of nearby furniture. The sagas, for all their poetic exaggerations, treat the berserker trance with a kind of fascinated fear. The word used for it, berserkergang, wasn't just a description, it was a state of being. One didn't simply go berserk like someone goes for a jog. It was a transformation, temporary, yes, but profound. And once it started, the best anyone could hope for was to stay out of the blast radius. Accounts of Berserker gang tend to describe it in stages, like a particularly intense weather event. First came the shaking the body, beginning to tremble, as if some unseen energy had started winding itself up inside. Teeth gnashed, eyes widened. Some were said to foam at the mouth, which, if you're wondering, is never a good sign from a man holding an axe. Then came the growling. Berserkers reportedly howled like animals, wolves, bears, things better left in fairy tales and forests. Their speech, if they managed any, became guttural, distorted, less like a battle cry, and more like something that had spent too long under a glacier. And then came the violence. To witness a berserker in full swing was to see the line between man and myth vanish under a blur of motion and blood. They threw themselves at the enemy not with discipline, not with strategy, but with the raw, animalistic force of something that had broken out of its own skin. They didn't just fight. They collided with opponents. They didn't parry or sidestep. They bulldozed, bit, slammed, and hacked. One account describes them as indifferent to steel, which is poetic for they didn't seem to notice they were being stabbed. Pain, as far as the berserker was concerned, was someone else's problem. Now, if you're imagining some kind of invincible war god who danced through arrows like a fireproof ballet dancer, slow your roll. Berserkers could and did die in battle. They bled. They lost limbs. They just didn't care. That was the terrifying part. They charged through wounds that would have left most people curled up in a field, questioning the meaning of life. The trance didn't make them immortal. It made them unstoppable, right, up until they stopped. And when they did, well, that was a different kind of spectacle. The sagas speak of the aftermath almost as vividly as the battle itself. Berserkers who survived their frenzy didn't just brush off the blood and head to the mead hall. They often collapsed, shaking and disoriented, like a storm that had exhausted its energy. Some would fall into deep sleep, others wept. Still more wandered aimlessly, lost in a fog of post-trance confusion, unaware of what they'd done or who they'd done it to. The rage, once gone, left a vacuum, a kind of emotional hangover, with no aspirin in sight. There's a famous line in Egil's saga that describes berserkers as men who howled like dogs and bit their shields. That's not metaphor. Shield biting was apparently a real thing, a kind of pre-battle warm-up that told nearby warriors, hey, this guy, you should give him some space. The biting wasn't just for show. It was a signal, an ominous, wooden gnawing signal that the trance was coming, and you probably didn't want to be standing in front of it when it arrived. Imagine this happening in a battle line. The war horns blow. The enemy shouts their own cry. And in your ranks, a berserker starts convulsing, howling, gnawing at his shield like it insulted his ancestors. Other warriors look sideways, whispering to each other, right. Here we go again. And then the berserker breaks rank and charges forward, alone, dragging everyone else behind him like a man-shaped war drum. The psychological impact on the enemy must have been tremendous. One moment you're preparing for a fight, the next you're watching a figure streak toward you, covered in animal pelts and foam, eyes rolling, mouth open in an expression that says, I've just discovered a new and exciting form of chaos, and you're invited. Even trained warriors hesitated, not out of cowardice, but because facing a berserker wasn't just fighting a man. It was facing an event. Some scholars have compared the berserker trance to states of temporary psychoseizure, kind of dissociative break where the person's identity fragments and instinct takes over. The berserker doesn't process what he's doing in real time. He's not planning, not weighing outcomes. He's responding to pain, to threat, to the deep, pounding drumbeat of violence that his culture has told him is sacred. Of course, not everyone bought into the mythology wholesale. Even in Viking society, there were skeptics, people who saw the trance as more theatrical than divine. He's not possessed, one might mutter. He's just been hitting the mushroom stew again. But even those who doubted the divine origin didn't doubt the danger. Whether mystical or merely unhinged, berserkers had a way of convincing people to reconsider their life choices. Which brings us to the question nobody really wants to answer. What did it feel like inside the trance? The unfortunate reality is that we'll never know for sure. Berserkers didn't leave memoirs. They didn't jot down post-fight reflections on the spiritual nuances of chewing on shields. What we do know comes from the outside, from sagas, from court records, from the wide eyes of survivors. But if we squint a little, we can piece together a rough, emotional sketch. To enter Berserker Gang was to shed the self, to burn away hesitation, to become a weapon, not in the hands of a king, but in the grip of something older, a god perhaps, or a trauma, or simply the raw, animal memory that still lives in the corners of all of us, the part that doesn't reason, doesn't reflect, just reacts. It's easy to romanticize this, to imagine the trance as glorious, heroic, but that's like calling a hurricane ambitious. Berserker Gang wasn't beautiful, it was destructive. It left broken bodies, frightened allies, and deep psychological craters in its wake. It was worshipped, yes, but from a distance. And when the storm passed, the man who remained was often haunted by what the beast had done. If you think of the trance as a kind of temporary madness, you're not far off. It served a purpose. It allowed men to do things no sane person would do, but it came at a cost. The price of being the storm is that you don't always remember who you were before it hit. And perhaps that's the most sobering thought of all, that berserkers, for all their glory, were not just warriors, they were vessels, carriers of a rage so vast, so old, that even they couldn't hold it for long. When they fought, it wasn't just a man against a man, it was chaos given shape. And when it ended, they were left with silence. Not peace, just the kind of silence that comes after something loud has broken everything it could reach. So, if you ever find yourself reading a saga and thinking, wow, I wish I could have seen a berserker in action, take a breath. Then imagine the sound of screaming, the taste of blood in the air, the confusion of a battlefield, spinning around a single figure who doesn't stop, doesn't listen, and doesn't know his own name until long after the fight is done. You didn't watch a berserker trance. You survived it. There are hangovers, and then there's what happens after you spend 3 hours in a battle frenzy, covered in blood, howling at the gods, and possibly gnawing on someone's ribcage. The average Sunday morning regret might involve a questionable text message and some leftover kebab on your pillow. The berserker version? Well, imagine waking up with no memory of what your body just did, lying in a swamp of carnage, and slowly realizing that one of the corpses used to be your friend and another might be your cousin. And no, there's no coffee strong enough for that. Because for all the noise and fury surrounding the berserker legend, there's one part that history rarely lingers on: the silence after. What happened after the Berserker Gang wore off? After the axe was dropped, the blood cooled, and the chanting faded into memory? The sagas love to dwell on the frenzy, the unstoppable warrior howling through enemy ranks like a one-man plague. But they rarely stick around to show you the man curled up in the dirt afterward, shaking, blank-eyed, and suddenly very aware of just how much horror he's become part of. It wasn't pretty. The come-down from a berserker rage, what we might call the berserker hangover, wasn't a punchline. It was a psychological freefall, like being shot out of a cannon into your own conscience. That's assuming you made it out of the battle alive, which many didn't. But those who did survive faced something arguably worse: the long, drawn-out business of remembering what you'd done when you weren't quite yourself. Some sagas do hint at this in their own cryptic way. Berserkers are described as falling into stupors, as spent or trembling after the rage, not just tired, depleted, as if their soul had been temporarily evicted, and now that it was trying to move back in, it found the furniture rearranged and the walls still bleeding. These weren't heroic cooldowns, they were collapses, psychological crash landings that left the berserker fragile, vulnerable, and not particularly fit for polite company. And speaking of company, This is where things got even messier, because society, while happy to employ the services of someone who could single-handedly obliterate a village, didn't always know what to do with that person afterward. Berserkers didn't exactly slot back into everyday life. You can't expect a man who's just ripped 3 people in half to go home, change into something clean, and peacefully churn butter. That's not how emotional regulation works, especially not in a culture that encouraged bottling everything up until it exploded in violence, and then quietly expected you to act normal again by supper time. There was no counseling, no debrief, no therapist sitting in a longhouse somewhere asking, "And how did that make you feel, Bjorn?" Because the answer would likely involve a sudden flashback and a broken bench. The emotional aftermath of Berserker Gang had to be processed alone, not at all. It's likely that many berserkers carried what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. The symptoms described in the saga's mood swings, unpredictability, detachment, outbursts, could easily map onto modern understandings of combat trauma. Only back then, it wasn't treated. It was either ignored, punished, or reinterpreted as the gods working in mysterious and deeply inconvenient ways. You can imagine how isolating that must have been. These weren't just warriors, they were veterans of psychological annihilation. They had seen things, done things, and felt things that had no place in a functioning community. They were both honored and ostracized, invited to feasts, but kept at arm's length, like a necessary evil in a well-ventilated cloak. You wanted them on your side, yes, but not too close. Not where they might remember something unpleasant in the middle of dinner and decide to relive it using the cutlery. Some, no doubt, retreated, into the woods, into themselves, into whatever ritual spaces remained where they could safely be alone with their memories. Others didn't retreat so much as unravel. There are stories quiet, grim little corners of the sagas where former berserkers descend into madness, not the poetic kind, the dangerous, disjointed, wandering kind. One moment they're seated with the king, the next they're attacking a stranger for the crime of coughing too loudly. And yet, even in their decline, they were rarely dismissed outright. There was still a trace of fear, a reverence, perhaps, for the sheer scale of destruction they had once been able to summon. But it was a reverence laced with discomfort, like staring at a cracked statue of a god whose temple has long since burned down. Which brings us, reluctantly, to guilt. It's easy to imagine that berserkers, so far gone in their rage, felt nothing for what they did. But that's not how trauma works. It loops, it waits. It reappears when you least expect it. And while some may have buried their emotions beneath layers of ritual and denial, others, especially those who aged, slowed, and softened, must have felt the weight of it. The guilt wasn't always personal, though. Sometimes it was structural. As the world shifted, Christianity creeping into Norse lands, old gods being pushed aside, many berserkers found their very existence called into question. They weren't just outdated, they were dangerous relics of a pagan past. What had once been seen as divine frenzy was now framed as demonic possession. And when society tells you that your entire identity is evil, that your past glories are now sins, it does things to a man. Some converted, some resisted, some vanished altogether. Their skills were no longer needed, their rage no longer welcome. Imagine being trained your whole life to channel something ancient, violent, and reverently, to wake up one day and find the world has moved on. There are no more raids, no more battles, just farmland, sermons, and the slow, grinding rhythm of peace. Peace, it turns out, is terrifying when all you've ever known is war. There's a haunting irony here. The very thing that made berserkers powerful also made them unfit for the world that followed. Their fury, once celebrated, became a liability. Their trance, once a link to gods, became a symptom. And so, many died not in glorious battle, but in obscurity, or madness, or at the hands of people they once protected. It's a deeply human ending when you think about it. Beneath all the animal skins and howling, berserkers were still people, people trained to suppress emotion, to embrace pain, to let go of control. And when the battle ended, when the gods grew silent and the chants stopped echoing, all they had left was the echo of their own broken rhythm. Some tried to rebuild, some clung to old rituals, others simply faded, forgotten by the same sagas that once praised them. Which brings us, strangely, back to today, because the Berserker story stripped of its myths, its shield-biting theatrics isn't just about ancient warriors. It's about what happens when we ask people to do things no human should do, and then offer them no path back. It's about the cost of rage, the weight of memory, and the long, lonely walk home from the edge. So yes, the Berserker come down isn't the stuff of saga verse. It doesn't make for thrilling poetry or triumphant endings, but it's real, and it lingers, in the quiet, in the shaking hands, in the eyes that once saw the world through a veil of blood, and now see I tat last too clearly. And that might be the cruelest twist of all, to finally feel again, just in time to realize what you've become. There comes a time in every culture's life when it has to sit down, take a long hard look at itself, and say, maybe we should stop glorifying the shirtless man who foams at the mouth and kills people over dinner seating. For the Norse world, that moment came slowly, reluctantly, and only after centuries of letting the Berserker run the emotional equivalent of a blowtorch through social gatherings, military campaigns, and the occasional wedding feast. It wasn't an overnight shift, no cultural tradition wrapped in blood, myth, and a deep appreciation for animal pelts ever fades with a whisper. The Berserker didn't vanish because someone passed a memo around saying, please refrain from going into psychotic battle trances on church property. No, their decline came like winter in the north, gradually, then all at once, with a lot of biting wind and the subtle, creeping realization that something in the world had changed. To understand why berserkers disappeared, we have to remember why they existed in the first place. In the early Viking age, berserkers filled a particular niche, terrifying, spiritually charged shock troops that could turn the tide of battle just by showing up and biting a shield. They were walking psychological warfare, human panic buttons, unleashed at moments when ordinary violence simply wasn't getting the job done. They also reflected a cultural reality. The Norse world view was one that honored strength, fatalism, and personal glory. To die in battle wasn't a tragedy, it was the golden ticket to Valhalla. And what better way to earn that spot than by becoming a one-man hurricane on the battlefield, howling Odin's name and trampling anything with a pulse. But cultures don't stay frozen in time. They evolve, adapt, and occasionally get steamrolled by outside forces carrying crosses and Roman organizational habits. Enter Christianity, the spiritual rebranding campaign that swept through Europe like a divine merger, slowly buying out old gods and replacing them with saints, bishops, and an overwhelming urge to suppress nudity and spontaneous acts of public violence. Christianity didn't arrive in Scandinavia like a flash flood. It seeped in over centuries, spreading through trade routes, political marriages, missionary work, and a generous helping of royal conversion incentives. It began as a whisper, a curiosity, something foreign and strange, but like all good monotheistic systems, with long-term strategic planning, it knew how to play the long game. And one of the things it didn't particularly appreciate was berserkers. The berserker, after all, was everything Christianity was trying to regulate out of existence. He was primal, unpredictable, possessed by spirits that were not approved by the bishopric, and prone to solving minor disagreements with axe-based overreactions. He represented a form of power that didn't answer to the church, didn't tithe, and didn't respond well to sermons about turning the other cheek. So how do you tame a wild cultural figure like that? You don't. You demonize him. As the Christian worldview took root, Berserker Gang began to be reinterpreted. What was once a sacred trance blessed by Odin became, in the new religious PR campaign, a demonic possession. That same frothing rage that had once been revered as a divine gift now looked suspiciously like the sort of thing a priest might try to exorcise with incense and a disapproving tone. Legal codes began to catch up with theology. In Iceland, which adopted Christianity officially around the year 1000, after one of history's more pragmatic parliamentary votes, laws were passed that explicitly outlawed Berserker gang. That wasn't a vague nod to improved manners, it was a targeted blow. If you flew into a trance and started attacking people under the old ways, you weren't seen as touched by the gods. You were a criminal. And not the fun kind of criminal, either the outlawed, no rights, please feel free to kill this man on sight, kind. Over time, as the church gained influence and centralized power structures began to take hold, the space for men, like berserkers, grew smaller. Warfare became more organized. Military tactics started favoring discipline over spectacle. Kings didn't want berserkers anymore, they wanted professional soldiers who wouldn't accidentally decapitate a noble during post-battle celebrations. And let's not forget the optics problem. A king trying to establish diplomatic relations with a neighboring realm doesn't want to explain why his top warrior just growled at the ambassador and tried to wrestle a candle. Berserkers didn't fit into the increasingly bureaucratic, priest-blessed, parchment-heavy reality of medieval power. They were the wrong kind of legend, too visceral, too pagan, too prone to unpredictable murder. Some tried to adapt. The Berserker tradition didn't die quietly. It morphed, diluted, and scattered. Some former Berserkers found roles as mercenaries or bodyguards. Others faded into the background of saga and song, their real-world presence gradually replaced by literary exaggeration. They became more metaphor than man-symbols of raw strength and chaos, invoked for dramatic effect but no longer welcomed at actual gatherings. By the 13th century, the Berserker was mostly a memory, a figure from the past, a warning perhaps, or a tale told by firelight to explain why Cousin Hrolf doesn't come to dinner anymore. The saga writers, working in a world increasingly shaped by Christian morality, portrayed berserkers as both mighty and dangerous, worthy of respect, but also a cautionary example of what happens when rage goes unchecked and old gods are no longer in charge. But the real tragedy, slow-burning human one, wasn't just the loss of a warrior tradition. It was the loss of a place for that kind of person in the world. The man who had been raised to believe that rage was holy, that pain was a doorway to power, that death in battle was a form of ascension. What happened to him when the world moved on? Some adjusted, some didn't. Some likely kept the rituals alive in secret, whispering Odin's name where no priest could hear. But the culture that once gave them purpose no longer existed. Their gods were fading. Their rites were outlawed. Their fury, once sacred, now read as madness. And that's the twist, isn't it? Berserkers didn't stop being who they were. The world just stopped making room for them. If you've ever felt the ground shift beneath you, if you've ever watched something you loved become obsolete, if you've ever wondered what to do with a fire that no longer has a hearth, then you understand the decline of the Berserker better than you think. It wasn't just the end of a tradition, it was the end of an entire way of seeing power, purpose, and the divine. The Christianization of Scandinavia wasn't subtle, but it was thorough. The churches were built, the old sites repurposed, the rituals scrubbed of teeth and blood. The rage that had once echoed through valleys and over fjords now whispered in the margins of manuscripts, tamed by ink and liturgy. And somewhere, perhaps, in the woods or the mountains or a forgotten island, the last Berserker screamed one final Timino for glory, not for Odin, but because the silence had finally come for him. And it did not scream back. It's always a little awkward when history becomes a t-shirt, especially when that history involves frothing Norsemen in bear pelts, committing acts of strategic homicide while howling at the sky and ignoring stab wounds like they're inconvenient rumors. Because somewhere between the 10th century battlefield and your cousin's favorite Viking-themed video game, the Berserker stopped being a terrifying symbol of divine rage and became, well, a vibe, a brand, an aesthetic involving a lot of leather, some tribal tattoos, and a heavy metal soundtrack that may or may not include a man screaming in Old Norse. The Berserker, in modern pop culture, has achieved a kind of mythical, second life one, not especially tethered to historical accuracy, but rich in eyeliner, slow-motion axe swings, and motivational gym posters. And look, it's not hard to see why. Unstoppable, Viking rage monster is a solid character archetype, especially if your plot involves revenge, sword fights, or getting shredded in preparation for battle scenes filmed entirely in the rain. But as with all things plucked from the smouldering ruins of history and handed to the content machine, what we got is less anthropology and more cosplay. In the sagas, berserkers were contradictory, figuratively, and horrifying, protectors and predators. They were complex in the way trauma and mythology tend to be. But in most pop culture renderings today, that complexity has been lovingly flattened into something more digestible. Today's Berserker is essentially Norse Hulk, angry, violent, occasionally shirtless, and typically male to the point of parody. Subtlety is for monks. The modern Berserker rips his way across comic books, fantasy novels, RPGs, and streaming dramas with a singular mission: hit things harder than anyone else, and look good doing it. You see it everywhere. In video games, the Berserker class is your go-to melee powerhouse. High damage, low defense, and usually equipped with an axe the size of a dinner table. They don't strategize. They don't block. They swing, scream, and occasionally explode into a rage mode that grants them temporary invulnerability, because nothing says historical accuracy like a glowing red rage bar. In fantasy literature, berserkers are often noble savages, haunted men with tragic pasts and short tempers who exist to mow down enemies and then stare broodingly into the fire. They're emotionally tortured, yes, but in a rugged, photogenic way that pairs nicely with slow violin music and deeply unnecessary shirtless scenes in the snow. The berserker has become shorthand for man too intense to process his feelings, so he processes your ribcage instead. And then there's the music. Ah yes, the heavy metal community. If there's one subculture that has lovingly adopted berserkers as their spiritual mascots, it's metal. And not the polite, radio-friendly variety, but the kind that uses album art involving wolves, thunder, and at least 3 kinds of fire. Berserkers are featured in song lyrics, band names, concept albums, and entire careers. They're often portrayed as unstoppable avatars of primal energy raging against civilization, conformity, and the limitations of traditional vocal techniques. It's not a coincidence. Berserkers embody a kind of rawness that metal music thrives on. The idea of tapping into something ancient and feral, of embracing chaos over control, of letting go so completely that the only thing left is sound and movement and maybe some light head traumates catnip for anyone trying to turn up the volume on human emotion. And it works. Because when you're screaming about ancient battles and bloodied snow, a berserker is a much better mascot than, say, an accountant. But here's the rub. Most of these modern interpretations, while thrilling, loud, and perfectly enjoyable in a cinematic, slow, mo kind of way, don't really get the berserker right. They get the energy, sure, the spectacle, but they miss the fear, the loneliness, the cultural tension of a figure caught between reverence and exile. The berserker wasn't just a warrior who hit hard. He was someone transformed, often against his own will, into a vessel of sanctioned madness. He didn't just scream, he disappeared into that scream. The trance state wasn't a power-up, it was a personal extinction event. And the aftermath? Not brooding nobility. More like tremors, social isolation, and the haunting suspicion that something inside you got permanently broken. Modern media tends to treat berserkers as cool, but in their own time, they were terrifying, respected, yes but also avoided, useful, but volatile. And when society no longer needed their particular brand of divine fury, it didn't write them loving epilogues. It outlawed them, branded them unstable, exiled them physically, spiritually, and historically. In that light, the Berserker isn't just a misunderstood warrior. He's a cautionary tale about what happens when a culture creates weapons out of people and then forgets how to put them back together afterward. Which isn't to say that pop culture should stop using them. Honestly, watching a Berserker tear through a battlefield with operatic flair is great entertainment. And if you want to crank some Wardruna while lifting weights in a faux fur cloak, you absolutely should. But it's worth remembering that the real thing was messier, darker, less heroic than tragic. The rage wasn't glorious. It was survival. And the transformation that modern media treats as a special effect was, in its original context, more like self-destruction, rebranded as sacred duty. Of course, we do this with a lot of historical archetypes. We simplify, we filter, we project. We take the raw data of human experience and run it through the narrative centrifuge until what's left is cleaner, clearer, and conveniently fits into a 90-minute runtime. The Berserker is just a particularly vivid example because rage, unlike wisdom or patience, photographs really well. And let's be honest, there's something seductive about the idea of losing control in a way that makes you powerful. Most of us spend our lives trying to not go berserk holding in anger, bottling stress, politely ignoring that guy on the bus who plays YouTube videos without headphones. The Berserker offers a fantasy. What if you could let go completely and the world would fear you for it? It's cathartic, it's cinematic, it's also wildly inaccurate. Because the real story isn't just about the rage, it's about what the rage cost, the training, the rituals, the trauma, the aftermath. The fact that berserkers often lived on the fringes celebrated when needed, shunned when inconvenient. The fact that the trance left them vulnerable, that the gods they invoked didn't always answer kindly, that the very thing that made them powerful also made them unfit for peace. If there's a modern comparison, it's not the comic book superhero. It's the combat veteran with untreated PTSD, the athlete who sacrifices their body for glory and is forgotten by the time the next season starts. The person who did what needed doing, only to find themselves alone with the consequences once the cheering stopped. But that's not a story we like to tell. It's harder to sell. It doesn't fit on a patch or scream well over double bass drums. So we keep the legend, the leather, the axes, the slow-motion rampages set to electric guitar, and we tuck the rest away, out of sight, off-screen, buried in the snow like so many forgotten bones. Still, the real legacy of the Berserker isn't just in the songs or the shows or the boss fights. It's in the questions they leave us with, about rage, about control, about what it means to become something other than yourself, and whether you ever really get to come back. Because if you peel away the mythology, the pop culture gloss, and the fur-lined fantasy, what's left isn't just a warrior. It's a man who screamed so loud the world remembered him, and then forgot why.